Continuing my series looking at old and rare railway series items, today's video contains books just about as old and rare as they come. These are my two copies of the 3 railway engines, both illustrated by William Middleton. For those who don't know, William Middleton was the first ever illustrator of the railway series. He worked on the first book in the series, but his work was found to be unsatisfactory and he was replaced for the second. Ultimately, his illustrations were redone by Reginald Dalby for the 8th edition in 1949. These are much better known today. Indeed, until Wilbert Awdry's biography, The Thomas the Tank Engine Man, was published in 1995, William Middleton was virtually unknown. I hope to make a follow-up video on William Middleton at some point. Anyway, here's my copy of the 3 railway engines with Dalby's illustrations. This format is probably the most familiar, with the shiny cardboard covers rather than the dust jacket. The Railway Series books went through several different formats before landing on what we would recognise today as the most common, but again, more on that in another video. Just to say, this copy of the 3 railway engines is the one I was given as a 1 or 2 year old, along with a copy of Thomas the Tank Engine, so I was hooked on these books from an early age. So, going back to the Middleton books, I'm going to take off the dust jacket very carefully. It's a little torn and weak in places, but the book is getting on for 80 years old, which is understandable. Underneath you can see we have a different colour cover to this one. It seems the early designs had either of these covers, or perhaps a plain pale one with just the title and not the outline of the engines. I'll put up an image of that. When the books were re-illustrated by Dalby, the dust cover changed to have his illustration on, but the design of the cover underneath stayed the same. It would later be updated to feature a bolded design of Edward, Henry and Gordon. I bought the copy with the dust jacket knowing what I was getting, but the other one was just a random eBay purchase I took a chance on, and it turned out to be another Middleton edition. On the back of the dust jacket, there is a logo of a waterfall with the words A. Lin Book underneath. I know nothing about this. I assume it's a company who assisted in preparing the book, but can find nothing about them online or in the Thomas the Tank Engine Man book, which has information about the publication history of the series. I'm not sure if it is a book by Lin or a book by someone with the initials A. Lin. I'm really unsure. If you have a look inside the dust jacket, there is a small blurb and the price. That's 4 shillings, which in today's money would be about £7. Then there are a couple of title pages, and then there's another example of that waterfall logo with the A. Lin Book underneath. And here is Edwin Ward, the publisher's information. It's recorded as being written by Reginald Awdry, but as I said earlier, William Middleton is not credited. If you have a look at the inside of the rear of the dust cover, there's nothing, it's just blank. It's not listed which edition this is, although it must have been before the 8th edition in 1949 when Dalby became the illustrator. Looking inside the other book, there is an advert for the second book in the series, Thomas the Tank Engine, on the back page, meaning that this edition must have been published after book 2 had been. If we have a look inside at how the stories are laid out, the texts and illustrations are as we would expect from subsequent editions. As the official recordings and fan recordings are available elsewhere, and all the illustrations are available online, I thought what I'd do is compare how the book progressed through Awdry's original sketches, through Middleton's early editions, and then into the final works of Dalby. Okay, so we start with this first illustration of Edward's Day Out. Awdry has a shed with 6 berths with 6 steam engines. The one on the right is Edward, and then the other 5 are just bigger engines who are mean to Edward in the story. For Middleton's illustration, he moves the angle around to give it a bit more interest, and then colours in the engines. Dalby then recolours them and makes it more clear that the engine next to Edward is Gordon by giving him the square buffers. It's not clear if this is Gordon, although it does look a bit like him in the Middleton illustrations. And in the illustration of Edward coming out of the shed, this is our first proper view of a steam engine in the whole series unencumbered by a shed or being blocked by other engines. and Middleton's moved around slightly, and you get a bit of scenery in the background. And what's really apparent is that Dalby has just sort of copied absolutely everything that Middleton's done for the most part, and just made it a bit brighter, bolder and clearer. Although Awdry's depictions of the engines are very simplistic, it's clear that he wants all the engines to have a unique shape and different numbers of wheels. There are also 3 dots on Edward's tender here, possibly representing the letters NWR. Although Middleton's engines normally look quite bright and bold, the rest of his illustrations are quite washed out and look quite pale in the background. What Dalby does is he makes the backgrounds, so the scenery, the sky, look a lot more clear, bold and vivid for the children reading. Awdry's illustrations of Edward at the station are all very complete, with the station, the road, the bridge, and this is due to the geography is quite important in this part of the story, with the guard running down to the station. In Middleton's illustration, it's quite clear from this illustration that he doesn't quite have scale and perspective right. Edward's boiler has changed in size quite a lot throughout the story so far, and that guard looks quite tall. I think it's fair to say that Dalby's neatened up what Middleton has done, but I think Wilbert gave some really good reference illustrations for this pair. And I must admit, this is my favourite illustration in the whole book. It's nice to see Edward having a nice time, and I think it really is the first time you get that sort of pastoral idyll that we recognise from Dalby's illustrations, that he sets up for other artists to follow later in the series. So moving on to Edward and Gordon, it doesn't look like Awdry's illustrations are available for these, so what I'm going to do is I'll just bring up a few other points in regards to this old edition with Middleton's illustrations. So Wilbert, even from the start of the series, was hopeful of a proper respect for accuracy of railway detail in the stories and illustrations. He initially wanted to use his own sketches, but he was told they were not good enough. And then he was disappointed by Middleton's work, with the characters sort of looking very toy-like, with their tendons attached to their bodies, much like the Ertl die-cast toys, and their faces being much too round as if drawn by coins. The illustrations of what in later years would be realised as Wellsworth Yard were actually really decent attempts at a railway scene, although probably spoilt a bit by how the engines are depicted. But I'd say in these 2 illustrations, Middleton is probably at his most accomplished in the whole volume. Gordon on the Hill is probably the most obvious example of what Middleton didn't do right. The size of Gordon's face and his general shape are just obviously grotesque, as are all his wheels being the same size. It's quite unusual looking. The strange position and shape of his pistons is also just odd, and his narrow buffer beam makes him look very top heavy. There are also those strange figures in front of him. Middleton is not great at drawing nice figures. It's also interesting to note that very few of the technical features of the Railway series had yet to be realised. So the livery is blue, but with yellow lining, and Edward's wearing a brass dome. All the tenders are of a different style to in the main series, and Gordon has not yet gained his obvious square buffers. Dalby's faces, although sometimes a little crude, were very expressive, and many of his designs led to the familiar TV series masks. Middleton, unfortunately, isn't able to capture much emotion in his engines' faces. Many of Middleton's illustrations also lack a sense of railway scene in them. The signal and telegraph wires Dalby adds here to this illustration give it so much more depth and realism as an image. It also seems that Middleton has given his engines black wheels, something which would be corrected and updated, along with the rest of the technical inaccuracies for Edward, Henry and Gordon in the following book. Okay, so now we're moving on to the sad story of Henry, and Henry's problems begin in the first book. So right from the start, from Awdry's illustration, we can see that Henry is illustrated as an Atlantic, and in this story both Middleton and Dalby portray him as Pacific. Awdry's illustrations tended to be simple little things, with just the key information like here is the engine and it's pulling a train, or here is the engine and it's standing at a station. But Middleton's work here almost sort of dumbs down what Wilbert drew as he omits the tree and the little animal at the front. However, Dalby does add some more of the railway scene with the signal, and he also has that really quite impressive sun beams coming through the clouds at the back. Another quite one of my favourite images from this book. As well as getting Henry's shape wrong, Awdry was also annoyed at how the illustrators kept adding another bore to the tunnel. It's clearly a single bore in his illustration, but Middleton makes the mistake of having two throughout the story, which is something that Dalby copies. For this illustration, there seem to be two done by Awdry here. One of him in the tunnel while it rains, and another with the guard waving the flag, which is the one that Middleton based his illustration from, and then which Dalby copied. I really like Awdry's illustrations for this section of the book with the passengers and the engine trying to get Henry out of the tunnel. As it's sort of square on to the action with Henry stuck in the tunnel at the time, I think it would make a really nice set of bookends. The engine here is of a similar shape to Edward, and it's not clear when Wilbert drew these illustrations if he was considering all the railways to be different as he was at the start, or if they had already been joined by this time. At another point, I'll make a video about all the different engines that appear in this book in the different versions. It's got to be said that Middleton's figures trying to pull Henry out of the tunnel look absolutely ridiculous. Although Wilbert's illustration is accurate as it shows the new bore being dug, I do really like the way that Middleton and Dalby end with a close-up of Henry looking shocked, peeking over his brick wall. I think it's a really effective way to end the story. Okay, and moving on to the last story in the book, Edward, Gordon and Henry. There are a couple of illustrations missing from this one. This first illustration from the last story is almost identical by each of the three illustrators, similar to how Edward at the station in Edward's Day Out was copied perfectly by each subsequent artist. So we don't have Awdry's sketch for this second illustration, and Middleton just basically has a still, doesn't really look like Gordon's moving very much, but Dalby creates this really wonderful sense of movement in his Gordon, and it's probably, along with Henry in the rain and Edward going under the bridge, one of the best illustrations from the book. Again here, almost all the illustrations tie up perfectly. Awdry's put some really good detail into Gordon's back head, which Middleton and then Dalby both copy as well. Awdry's next illustration shows Edward and Gordon. For some reason, neither of them have buffers, and Gordon has moved to a siding on the other side of the line. Middleton has mirrored this, and then Dalby copies it. Again, Middleton's idea of scale and his issue with scale is really quite apparent here. It's also a rare change that Dalby makes here. Middleton gives Gordon a sort of an upset or grumpy face, and Dalby updates it to be a more sort of sympathetic face while Edward is struggling. So at first glance, all three of these illustrations look very similar. However, in each of them, Henry has a different wheel arrangement. In Wilbert Awdry's original, he has his, as Wilbert would think, proper Atlantic wheel arrangement. Middleton keeps him with a Pacific wheel arrangement, and Dalby for some reason has changed him to a 460. Maybe his training wheels rusted off in the tunnel. The next illustration is the one from both William Middleton's cover and Reginald Dalby's cover. However, we don't have Wilbert's original sketch for what he wanted here. And again, the only real updates, apart from obviously Henry is now missing a set of wheels, is that Gordon is shown to be sort of happy and encouraging in Dalby's work, whereas in Middleton's he's still not very happy. For the following image, we also don't have Wilbert Awdry's original sketch for it, the one with the top hat flying into the goat field. Both images are very similar, but as with so many other illustrations, Dalby's use of brighter and bolder colours makes the engines storming towards the sunlight more dramatic and uplifting than Middleton's slightly washed out picture. The last illustration shows all three engines back at the shed, with Henry being repainted from green to blue. The shed in Awdry's picture would suggest there's a turntable in the sheds, as Gordon is at a 90-degree angle to the other engines. Middleton sets up the engines in a more attractive setup, which Dalby copies. Although, here, Dalby has got some odd perspectives, with some of the painters looking much too tall. Little details like the village in the background have again been copied, from Middleton through to Dalby. And that's my review of my early copies of the three railway engines, with a bit of Dalby's own work in there as well. I hope it didn't sound like I was dunking on Middleton too much. I think he deserves recognition for being the first Railway series illustrator, even if his drawings aren't always the most accurate. I hope this was of some interest, and thanks for watching.